Welcome. I'm Karen Jenkins Johnson, principal of Jenkins Johnson Gallery in San Francisco and New York. Thank you for joining us. My team and I hope that you're healthy, safe, and well. Happy Black History Month, and welcome to our 22nd Conversation on Culture, a discussion with artists, curators, and collectors on current art world topics. Today, César García-Alvarez is in conversation with our artist of our exhibition De Lo Mío that opens tomorrow, Saturday, February 13th at Jenkins Johnson Projects in Brooklyn. The exhibition continues through March 27th. Today's conversation is part two of a two-part conversation. Part one was with César and Tiffany Alfonseca, the curator. Part two, today, Friday, February 12th, is with participating artists, Tiffany Alfonseca, Uzumaki Cepeda, Veronica Fernandez, Monica Hernandez, Joiri Minaya, and Bianca Nemelc. There will be a Q&A at the end of the conversation, so please join us via the Q&A button. Also join in the chat during the conversation. We anticipate this conversation will go probably a little bit over, and we hope that you're able to stay as long as possible. I'm honored to introduce César García-Alvarez. He is the founding director and chief curator of the Mistake Room in Los Angeles, an internationally focused nonprofit art space. Prior to founding the Mistake Room, he served as associate director and senior curator of LAX Art. In 2012, he was one of the curators of the first Made in LA biennial organized by the Hammer Museum. And in 2013, César serves as the US Commissioner for the 13th Cairo Biennial in Egypt. Currently, he is co-curator of the forthcoming edition of Desert X 2021. Welcome, César, Tiffany, Uzumaki, Veronica, Monica, Joiri, and Bianca to Conversations on Culture. Now let's get after it. This should be a lot of fun. Here you go, César.
Thank you so much and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to do a brief introduction today, but I want to forefront that my job today is going to be easy. My job today is going to be to shut up as much as possible. It's been a great experience to work with Tiffany and to get an opportunity to get to know these remarkable artists over the past couple of weeks. But I'll sort of acknowledge that in an exhibition that's really focused in uplifting the work of women artists, my privileged position as a man in terms of both writing about this work and being able to be in conversation, I think has to be acknowledged. And my job here is mostly going to be to steer a conversation and let the artists do what they do and let them speak to us about their practices and their work. I'm going to start off to give a broad introduction of the exhibition and mention a couple of things that I think are important to set a baseline for our conversation this afternoon. This exhibition, De Lo Mío, is a show that brings together the work of 6 artists with varying relationships to their Dominican American heritage. It's very important to acknowledge and note that it is not a Dominican art show or a Latinx art show, but very much so an exhibition that actually tries to push back against the problematic ways that genre-based or geographically based exhibitions shape art and its histories. The notion of attempting to create overarching genre removes differences that are very real, embodied, and lived. I will say that while we don't have the time to speak about the nomenclature of these terms and the debate that's quite charged around them, the word Latinx will serve as an interesting sort of North Star to guide us, but more so not in a very framed in a very different way and sort of informed and inspired by the work of scholar Claudia Milian, for whom the word Latinx doesn't just reference or acknowledge sort of differences in gender, but where the X becomes an opportunity to acknowledge our different experiences and identity, not as a fixed entity, but rather as a site of contestation and debate. That X here acknowledges that while many of us have ties to mother countries cited within the Latin American imaginary, our lives are forged through the movement and migration of our families or even ourselves, and as such create unique varying experiences that X acknowledges as a form of kind of both displacement and destabilization of these categories. To get us started on the exhibition this afternoon, I'm going to go ahead and ask to get us started, for those of you who aren't familiar with the work of these remarkable artists, for you to introduce yourselves and maybe tell us a little bit about some of the ideas that drive the work you're presented in this exhibition before we dive into our broader conversation. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. My name is Bianca Nemelc, and my art explores the relationship between the body, or the brown body to be exact, and the natural worlds. And a lot of what I'm unpacking is identity, lineage, and just the way that we build our relationships with the natural world. What does that look like? What does it look like in our imagination? And what does it look like, in the real physical space? And how do we take up space in those places? And that's what my work explores.
I'll go second.
Great.
My name is Veronica Fernandez, and I'm a figurative painter from Los Angeles, California. My work discusses relationships between people and relationships between people and their environments, and how the factors of those environments can influence them, as well as how we reflect on the experiences that we go through over time, and how you can enter different headspaces depending on what those may be for you.
I can go next. I'm Joiri Minaya. I'm Dominican United Statesian visual artist. I'm based in New York, and I grew up in the DR, and I came here to study. And I've been here ever since. My work is thinking about those relationships between the global North and South and how they have impacted representation throughout time. And specifically, I'm interested in representation of Black and Brown women in the Caribbean and in the tropics in general, and how that colonial history has informed the way that we still see those images, and trying to find agency through that gaze, and thinking about the idea of embodying some of these representations and stereotypes to cut through them and find that voice and that agency.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Alfonseca. I'm from the Bronx. And my work, I would say, is about kind of just normalizing the Black and Brown figure, and trying to like move away from the idea of fetishizing it, normalizing it, and making it okay to be brown, like in America, That's like a little summary of what I'm doing right now.
Who wants to go next?
Hi, my name is Monica Hernandez. I was born in the Dominican Republic, and I moved to the Bronx when I was 6 years old. My work tends to explore the figure inside of these domestic spaces. I'm really interested in sort of interior spaces as a way to explore our own bodies, our ancestry, our history, our culture, and basically just the way in which we can take up space. These interior spaces for me are constantly in flux, especially when moving here from the Dominican Republic. I noticed, a living room can be a bedroom, can be a prayer room, can be a dining room, and so I really became interested in feeling trapped, but also how we move and express within them, and yeah.
I think it's my turn, right?
Yeah.
All right, I got a lot going on. I'm in a nail salon. I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm not prepared. Was way longer than expected, but my name is Uzumaki Cepeda. I am an installation artist, textile artist. I create faux fur rooms, and I base my work around the idea of safe space. That's what um that's what I do. Yeah.
Is that
I don't know what else to say.
that's good?
Yeah.
I want. I want to. I'm glad to see you take a little self care is always great for everybody. Um,
Right.
I want to just jump into the conversation and talk about a recurring topic that came up in a lot of our studio visits. When Tiffany sort of asked me to sort of work alongside her in organizing, you know, these conversations and getting an opportunity to write about your work, we had I think one of the most difficult, but I also think one of the most exciting conversations, which is the way, talking a little bit about the way that your practices get consumed. And I want to use the word consumed because I think it speaks not just to both like the interest from like, you know, institutions or curators in understanding your practices, but I also think that very much so the market's implication into, you know, in how your work circulates and moves, and more so how your work gets framed through a lens of identity politics that is incredibly popular right now, both I think across institutional and market realms. But one of the sort of big problems is that when we have these conversations about talking about Dominican art, Dominican American art, Latinx art, Black art, I think that those attempts to homogenize in the service of creating a very pristine picture of similarities also removes deeply entrenched differences between your experiences. And the first shock for me as an observer into this process was how different you all talked about your relationships to your cultural heritage, to your familiar relationships. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that, because this exhibition is much more about understanding that there can be a broad spectrum when we think about identity as situational rather than as a category. And I think it's important maybe for us to have a chat and for the audience to hear about how important that notion or that idea of your identity is in relationship to your work and your relationships to your cultural heritage, particularly like your relationship to the Dominican Republic, because it's very different for all of you. So maybe we can sort of jump in and have a conversation about it, and you can share some of your ideas around that.
For me, it's always been a really interesting relationship because I was born in the Dominican Republic, but I didn't always feel, because I moved here when I was 6, I don't remember it as my home necessarily, but I do romanticize a lot of the very few memories I have and the images that I have. And the transitioning from the Dominican Republic to the Bronx, and, you know, going from open spaces to a 1-bedroom apartment with, you know, the 5 of us, it was kind of like this very jarring experience where I don't think I was able to really fully understand what it was like where I came from, but also make sense of New York. So for a long time, I kind of felt like this sort of kind of like a bad Dominican, because I wasn't like super patriotic or super connected, but also a bad American because I didn't really fit in, because, you know, I was like the weird new kid. So it's always been this really interesting experience of feeling really detached from a sense of belonging and feeling like I don't really have a home. And for a while it was kind of okay, but then I realized through my work all of the things that I was channeling early on, like my color palette, what I was intuitively drawn to, well, reminded me of a lot of the paintings that I grew up around in my home. So a lot of like landscape paintings, very like warm palettes, lots of like, you know, still lifes of fruits and stuff like that started making their ways into my work without me really thinking about it before I was as fluent as in my process. And I think through the years, as I've spent more time researching my own history and the history of just the Caribbean in general and America in general, I kind of have, through history is how I find myself, personally. And I have gained like a sense of belonging and an understanding of how I got to this point, and an understanding of how my work fits into everything, which is just, this is constantly something that we're working to define collectively, and there isn't a singular idea of what it means to be from these kinds of places. All of these nations are relatively young nations, and our relationship to identity is something that's constantly in flux. So that's kind of something that I tend to explore. I try not to be a little bit too fixed. I try to like allow myself to question it, because it's something that I still question myself.
Right. Joiri?
Um, Hi. I was born in New York, and I kind of sometimes say I was given birth to in New York because my mom intentionally came here to, so I could have U.S. citizenship. But I grew up in the Dominican Republic, and then I came back here at age 21 to study to finish my undergrad at Parsons. So my relationship to Dominicanness is, I don't know, it's interesting because I grew up in the island, but then it becomes something else as you are in the diaspora, and I've been here for almost 10 years now. So that's like constantly evolving, but a lot of the ways that I relate to my Dominicanness have to do with some sort of contentiousness or some sort of challenging because of all the things that I've ended up being interested in. It's basically, you know, feminism, decoloniality, and a lot of the things that are professed as Dominicanness sometimes are embedded in a patriarchal and colonial history. So it's interesting. I'm not saying that that is what Dominicanness is, because of course it's not, but just saying like it's been interesting to realize those things. And then living here for the last 10 years, I've also gotten to understand the lens through which Dominicanness is seen by people who may not be as familiar with the culture. And it always just boils down to tourism and the way that, you know, the island is represented and the people in the island are represented. And then I've ended up being interested in this relationship between the body and the landscape because of that conversation that keeps coming up as I navigate this new space. No longer new, but, you know, at some point new-ish. And yeah, I think I can keep talking, but I want to give the chance to someone else. Maybe I can come back.
Yeah, Veronica, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I feel like for me, I really related to everything Monica was saying, and it's why I admire her work so much. For me, I was raised by my Dominican father, who was raised by his Dominican mother, who was raised by her Dominican mother. So for me, my identity was always this kind of thing where I moved from originally Miami to New Jersey to now Los Angeles. But when I lived in New Jersey, I was set in this town where I was supposed to get a better life, surrounded by a lot of obviously white people, people that I felt I didn't really fit into, but also I didn't look the part or act the part the way that Dominicans would perceive me, or being being Puerto Rican and Bolivian, how they would perceive me either, mostly because I wasn't taught Spanish at a young age. And I was very disconnected from my family, the same way that Monica was, not with your family, but disconnected with the culture because I was disconnected with my family. Given that my dad wanted to separate us, to go to a town that he was familiar with in New Jersey where we can have a better life, a better school system, to give us a better future. So for me, it was kind of always this weird kind of disconnection where I felt like I obviously was not white at all, because that was that clear distinction. But I also felt like I wasn't fully accepted as a Dominican woman, as a Puerto Rican Bolivian. I just didn't feel accepted at all in any of those categories because of how I was raised. And I think through my work and how I really connect to my heritage, really became being my most honest self, which was the part that encompasses what the generations before me taught me. What my grandmother had taught my father, being a single mom, and what my dad, being a single father, taught me. And those values that you get from those generations are ways that I connected to my culture. And so I think the most recent experience I had was actually when we had the means to actually go to DR with my grandmother and my father. And over there is when I finally realized these connections, where we visited my great grandmother's house where they grew up and where my dad spent a lot of time with his cousins. And all these connections that I felt I didn't actually belong to at all, or I kind of found myself running away from. There was this point where I finally could see that line where I was like, okay, like there's this rope to this homeland, but there's a few knots in it, but I'm still, that connection is still there. And so the way I identify, like I said, is being just really understanding what values are within my family and the connections I've made over time. And so in my work, I like to encompass this idea of time, and how I can reflect on these experiences and these photographs that I work with.
Okay, you want to jump in? You want to go next?
Yeah. So for me, I think identity has always been a little bit complex. I grew up in Washington Heights, raised by my mom, my dad, my great-grandparents who came from DR in the 50s with their 4 kids, my grandparents. And my mom's side of the family is Dominican. So I was raised around Dominican culture. I've never been to DR. Growing up in Washington Heights, so I was very much immersed in it. But then there's also this other side, my father's heritage, which is Suriname and Indonesia. So for me, it kind of felt like, you go to one family party and you're one thing, and then you go to another and you go home and you're another thing. So for me, it was always kind of trying to connect to the culture where I felt like it was enough, where I felt like I was Dominican enough, or, whatever the case may be. So for me, my work kind of took the lens and drew it way out. Originally, I was working within the domestic space, but it still felt very small and micro because there were all these nuances in my identity. And for me, I felt like taking it out into nature was kind of this way to kind of pay homage to migration, to all the different types of places that I come from, all the lands that I haven't been, that, the feet and the hands and the skin that's been touched by sun in places I've never been. And for me, the nature kind of is that connection for me. And it's a way for me to reconcile, those parts of my identity that I've never been able to connect with the ones that I have, and, trying to find that common ground and that ownership within the natural space, which is supposed to be for everybody. But when I'm doing that, even then I'm unpacking all of these things that you're taught, whether it's about, whether it could be something as simple as being a city girl and being like, you can't do those things because you're from the city. You wouldn't like that. Or sunshine, if you're out in the sun too long, you're gonna get dark. All of these things that kind of come up even in your relationship to nature, and how those are affected by, culturally, what you're taught, what you don't realize you're taught. And so I'm kind of unpacking all of that through the lens of nature.
Uzumaki, do you want to tell us a little bit about your work's relationship to your Dominican identity and heritage?
Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry if it's noisy in here. Well, the way my work like reflects Dominican heritage is that I take like these spaces that I grew up with and like turn them into kind of like this dreamland. And also like a lot of places that I grew up in, it wasn't like completely safe. So that's why I started like basing my artwork around like safe spaces.
Yeah.
So I just like reimagine like from like a simple thing like my bedroom to like my living room. I like relived my Dominican experience, but in my own way. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Okay. Tiffany, do you want to tell us?
Yeah, so I mean, I was born here in the Bronx, but also like raised Bronx, Inwood, like Dykeman area. And I always had the relationship of going back to DR like during the summertime. So that was always something like that I would look forward to every summer. I feel like my relationship with the Dominican Republic is super strong. Like I'm super proud of where I come from. Everything. I feel like the culture is very, my work is very influenced by the culture, the music, the food, like parties, all that. So I definitely see it taking more of an approach now, especially with the work that I'm making for Lo Mío, for sure. Yeah.
There's a young adult novel by Elizabeth Acevedo called Poet X. And she's writing on about the experience growing up as Dominican American woman in New York. One of the first poems that really was striking to me, and I think it's interesting in what we just heard, is she says that some of the first words she heard growing up was "Pero tú no eres fácil," and that it was something that kept coming up, that her mother would tell her, that her grandmother would tell her, that her dad would tell her, that it was this sort of ongoing sort of thing. It's like, you're not easy. You're not easy to deal with. You're not easy as a person. I often feel that in the conversations I've been privileged to have with you all over the last couple of weeks, that came up a little bit in one way or another. And I wonder right now, when you show your work, when you talk about your work to curators, to collectors, to gallerists, how much do you feel that there's a kind of expectation that you perform your Dominicanness, and when you fail to do so, you sort of end up on the receiving end of that comment of, tú no eres fácil, when you can't fit into those boxes? Have you had those experiences? Can we talk a little bit about that? Do you feel like sometimes there's an expectation for you to perform this identity in relationship to your work? And how do you navigate that?
I feel like I, I'll speak first. I feel like because I've made my work about precisely those expectations and trying to challenge those, I maybe don't deal with that as much, although it is a result of having have to deal with that like in the beginning, maybe like 10 or 9 or 8 years ago, where definitely my identity was at the center of uh, the interpretations of everything I presented, whether they had to do with identity or not. And I feel like a lot of us may have had similar experiences in like art schools or exhibitions. Now I feel because my work is about that performativity, I feel there's the expectation of that, but from a more critical standpoint, as opposed to um, expecting the performativity that you're talking about. But I still think about those things. They still come up, not necessarily in the art context, just in the daily life, and they still inform my experience and my work. But I feel that at least people who are a little more familiar with my work are maybe not going to interpret it through that lens anymore. But for sure, people who are new to my work may be like, oh, flowery and tropical and like colorful and where are you from and where's your accent from and all of those things. But I feel like after there's a moment of like getting to know my work a little more, because my work is confrontational about those things, I think people kind of see themselves and become aware of their own ideas that they're bringing to that, and kind of switch it up a little.
Yeah. Monica, what about for you?
I feel like I've had a lot of different experiences, just like in art school and then even just like in real life and then even in my own family. I think for a while I was in school, I think I evaded like the narrative aspect of it because I felt like it was very difficult to talk about certain things in an environment where I feel like I didn't see myself reflected. Granted, I went to a CUNY, so even then it was more diverse in a lot of art programs, but I still kind of wanted to focus on the painting aspect and not necessarily on the story because I didn't feel like getting into an explanation of something that I felt like was so, like specifically already on the canvas. And then even then people ask you to like, go into like certain things and it's just kind of like, it's in the painting kind of thing. But I feel like for my work is kind of to a certain extent about that because my life has been about that, whether I wanted to or not. I just feel like I couldn't really make sense of like the dissonance of living here and then coming home, existing in an American world, in the New York world, and then coming home to a Dominican home. That's why I say yes, I came here at an early age, but even those years of transition were felt pretty long, where it was still like, I haven't seen so many movies, I haven't seen so many or heard so many like songs or classic albums of American culture. So I feel like a lot of what I did when I moved here was try to play catch up. But then at the same time, try to like, you know, bring my family into it. And then at the same time, try to make sense of what's actually me and what's actually me trying to perform all these different me's. And I live these many compartmentalized lives. And then I feel like they kind of came together in the work. And that's where it kind of got a little bit like eclectic and like intense. And the imagery was kind of like a bit quote unquote vulgar. And for a lot of people, it sometimes would make them uncomfortable. But for me, I don't know. I just felt like it kind of similar to what Joiri was saying, my relationship to DR and the beauty of it, but also feeling stifled by the patriarchy there. And like, you know, there's also like a lot of homophobia and stuff there. And it's a beautiful country, but I just couldn't make sense of like the strict Catholic guilt. And then like, you know, being a teenager with sexual desires. So I think it kind of, I don't know if I'm off topic, but it's just kind of, I feel like I have to perform in all aspects of my life. So my work is kind of like all these different like facets. And if you look at like previous work of mine, it's just like all these different forms in different parts of rooms. And I feel like looking back on it now, it's just kind of like that W.B. Du Bois, like double consciousness, but kind of even more than two. Like, you know, him talking about being a Black man in America, and then me talking about being, you know, Dominican, woman, queer, et cetera, and it's all these different like rifts in your personality and then how you operate in all these different contexts. So how you speak to someone in your own community versus how you speak to a collector versus how you spoke to a professor versus how you speak to a friend. And it's like, it's hard to keep track of it all, but you're constantly on in some kind of way. So it feels like when you're with the painting, at least that's when you get to like be who you are. So yeah.
Anybody want to comment on this, on the performativity? I want to watch our time too, but I want to, does anybody else want to share experiences, or do you want me to move on to the next topic, or anybody else want anything to say? No? Should we? I want us, the other one's sort of interestingly related, but I want us to talk about how you all think about the notion of identity, because those were some of the most interesting conversations I had with you all, in terms of how you position your sense of self, and then how you reflect that in your work or attempt to find distance in your work from that. But I think that coming into it was very clear from sort of Tiffany's directors when she invited me to sort of get to know your practices and, you know, write about them, moderate these conversations, was that we had a long chat about the notion that at least Tiffany, like, I don't want to speak for everybody, but at least in the conversations you and I have been having, is so much about how other people want to guide you into how you should be defining who you are. I'm not going to name anybody, but I will put out a public disclosure from my fellow curatorial colleagues to the collector base. You should never do that to an artist. Not only is it incredibly ignorant and a racist attempt to do, but I think that the notion of asking somebody to pick a lane is not something you ever have the authority to demand from another person. And in the process of organizing this exhibition, it has been angering for me personally to hear comments from you about the way you have to navigate those kinds of demands. Identity is situational. It is something that is determined first and foremost by the person who's defining their sense of self, but also inevitably shaped by both place and circumstance. Or for my academics in the audience, it's both shaped by both temporality and spatiality. And I think that I want to talk a little bit about how both history and place shape the bodies and subjects that that you engage with in your practice. So Tiffany, it'd be great to hear about like your relationship to the idea of domestic space and the biographical. I think Bianca, for you, like, you know, one of the most interesting parts for me about your practice is for you, the body is the place, is the land. I think often about Tirso de Amaral, I think about Ana Mendieta's relationship of body and land when I think about your work. Joiri, I think this, like you spoke about the space of tourism and shaping or othering the gaze and how that sort of shapes in many ways the figures and bodies that represent in your work. Monica, we talked a lot about the internal space, the psychological space where these figures come from. And then, you know, Veronica, we talked a lot about memory and recollection, like the notion of imaginative survival. And then Uzumaki quite literally creates spaces that then serve as sites in many ways for different personas that you create. So I just wanna, I'm not gonna kind of call on anybody because I think this is the meat of our conversation today in thinking about how you all get to reclaim an agency that allows you to both cite yourselves, but also think about identity as a spectrum that you have the authority to kind of mobilize and position how you are citing your work and citing your sense of personhood. So I know it's a lot there, but let's have a conversation about that, and what this sort of relationship of spatiality is in forming the subjects that you create, represent, or grapple within your practices.
Wait, is it me? Sorry.
Whoever.
Okay. Um,
I think Uzumaki's frozen right now, so somebody wants to jump in while we get Uzumaki back. No? Bianca, you want to jump in? I I don't want to have to do that weird thing, right? Come on, y'all. We did it in the rehearsal. No.
So for me, can you ask the question one more time? That was a lot.
It was a lot. It was a lot. I also emailed it to you before. But I want to talk a little bit about this sort of relationship of identity as situational, as something that's fluid and shaped by both your circumstance or the spaces in which you navigate
Yeah.
and a particular moment. So that's kind of the broad stroke. And in particular, you mentioned very early that the landscape was a way for you to navigate some of those complexities, but maybe now sort of I'd love to maybe hear more about that in an expanded way.
Yeah.
This topic. Yeah.
So for me, I think the natural environment is kind of like this safe space, so to speak, where I can place a body and there isn't an automatic assumption about the identity or what's happening. It's almost like this neutral space, so to speak, until you start injecting, whatever you think of in society or whatever you're taught. But I really enjoy putting the body in nature because to me, I think it's kind of this way to expand upon identity outside of the boxes that we put ourselves in. I think it's really easy to get stuck on, the label, whether it's, Latinx or, whatever it is. And I think me, because of the fact that I come from a multi-ethnic background, from a young age, I was very hyper aware of the nuances of identity. I didn't fit into one box, so it was very hard for me to fit myself into a box in a way where someone's like, "What are you?" And I'm like, "I could go on for an hour." Like I know everything about where I'm from and all those things. And I think for me, the beauty of identity is that you can zoom in or you can zoom out, and there's always a story to be told. And for me, that story is the larger grand scheme of like the macrocosm of what I am, and all those places that I come from outside of those boxes that people want to dictate I belong in. So a lot of times, whether the figures are just lounging, they're always in a state of relaxation, they're always in this state of confidence, and they feel like they're being nurtured and they're safe. Or sometimes they are the land itself, and it's kind of me navigating those ideas and those topics, whether it's about femininity or even ecology and nature itself, and our responsibility to that other aspect of our identity that we don't even really talk about, which is the identity outside of ourselves. And to me, that's how I relate to, spatial identity and to nature, and how that informs how I even view myself. A lot of times, now I'm so much more than all those lists of things that I could say that I am. And I think my work speaks about that.
Incredible. Who's gonna go next?
I love that because I feel like for me, I see like my paintings as kind of like these boxes where I can sort of not necessarily close myself in, but where I try to, I think because of my relationship being so kind of ambiguous at times, I kind of, with a lot of my works, try to pack it in with as much visual information as possible, and kind of things that remind me of things of my childhood without really looking back on it. So they're kind of like these warped memories. So in like the painting that's on the screen right now behind the toilet, there's like a little painting hung up, and that's as I was painting it, I was like, oh, a little like cherub sitting on the toilet using the bathroom while she's sitting on the toilet. And then when I came home, once I moved back here a few months ago, I realized I have that same little painting in my bathroom, and it's a painting that we've probably had like 10 to 15 years that we just got at like the dollar store when we first moved here or whatever. And I kind of like having this continuation of these landscape paintings or windows in the back of my work, and they're kind of like portals of this sort of continuous like Dominican landscape, because I would have in a lot of Caribbean households in general, you have a lot of these like sort of random little houses on a random, landscape scene. You don't really know where they are, who lives in there, or what's going on, but it's kind of like this continuous sort of like walk when you're looking at all of them. So I kind of like to access these sort of portals as a way in which is like a memory or a place in which you can fix it, but it's kind of nameless and placeless. It's not really rooted in a real life memory. And I feel like that's kind of how my relationship with DR is. It's kind of like this highly saturated, super sort of fictive, happy place, when in reality it probably wasn't solely that, but the contrast to moving here was so stark that that's kind of what I put outside of these sort of spaces as kind of like a placeholder of maybe what could have been. So yeah.
Who wants to go next?
When I hear your question, I think of like growing up in a relatively more homogenous society, and maybe that's a whole fantasy, but in relation to the DR, to the US, which is much more heterogeneous in how people identify and express themselves in this country, but at the same time it also has like an obsession with boxing identity and like neatly constructing the borders of this thing that you're this, you're not that, you're this label, you're that other label. And I think in response to that, my work has been well, first of all, very multidisciplinary. Like I keep encountering, actually going back to a previous question of yours, something that I didn't think about is that I keep encountering, people in the art world asking me, but what medium do you prefer? Like, what do you identify the most with? And I'm like, I'm interdisciplinary. I cannot choose one medium over another. I am equally as interested in Photoshop as painting, as designing fabric patterns, or performance or video. So I think that's definitely in response to certain ideas of an identity as an artist, right? But then as an identity as like cultural identity, thinking of like how I've realized that identity as seen from this other place about the Dominican Republic tends to be imaginary, but not like in the sense of this nostalgia or yearning or like this personal relationship that we're talking about here the most, but imaginary as a place of consumption and as a place of leisure and desire, and as a place where to project your own fantasies in a way that is not necessarily thinking about the subjects or the places that you're projecting onto. So and that relates, to what you were talking about, like tourism, the gaze, the othering. These are all kind of mechanisms through which the DR is seen and its people. Um, and I'm interested in like a more expansive and universal experience that can be transmitted through playing around with those ideas and those projections. Because I find that I guess what I found early on in my undergrad and like my early practice was that it didn't really matter what I did. It would always come back to this signifier. So then I started playing with this signifier as a way of kind of camouflaging within them and being like, this is what you expect, but I'm giving you something else, and I am confronting your own gaze and your own ideas through this work that I'm making. So that became more interesting. And playing around with ideas of opacity or not being legible, not being consumed, not being available, the image not being available in the way that you expected for that consumption.
I think we have Uzumaki back. And Uzumaki, do you want to talk a little bit about this? Because when we chatted, one of them, I think, really interesting things for me was also like your name and the multiple kind of personas that you embody when you navigate this. It's very much like a decision you make. And I also want to throw a shout out for everybody listening. Uzumaki has a gallery in LA. There's a lot of merch, police support, my lamp just came. Thank you, by the way.
Oh,
So
yay. Thank you.
so
Is my camera on?
it is. It's good.
Oh
Let's
my
see
God. I
you.
feel like I've been the only person just like doing the absolute fucking most throughout this whole call. So I apologize to everybody.
No.
I'm finally in a stable room. So yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you for
tell
the
us,
shout out.
yeah, and tell us a little bit about these, like your work and specifically like your name and this notion of creating multiple personas. We talked about that. Remember about your work creating these different kind of things, these different kind of personhoods, these that you get photographed in, and tell us a little bit about why the need to sort of create these kinds of personas and how that's important to your work overall.
Well, where do I start? Um, I feel like where my name came from, I wanted to rename myself because I just felt like, I was an artist, but I felt like rappers always rename themselves. So I was like, I want my rapper moment. And I renamed myself Uzumaki, which means spiral in Japanese, because I feel like my life is always spiraling in the most positive and negative way, all at the same time. And the way that correlates to my work too, I feel like I always have kind of like this positive and negative thing with my installations, because I feel like people see my installations and they see like soft and cute and like this safe space, but also like that place like also comes from like as I was saying, like recreating my childhood of places that came from like a lot of trauma and stuff. So yeah, I don't even know if I answered the question right.
That's good. Yeah. I want to be mindful of time, but I want to make sure I get an opportunity for Veronica and Tiffany to say whatever they may want to say, and then we actually have some really interesting questions that I think are going to lead us into the kind of tail end of this conversation. But yeah, Tiffany and Veronica, do you want to respond to this question too? Or
Oh.
Oh,
I'll make
you
it fast because y'all already heard a little bit about me. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like identity is playing like a really big role in my work now, especially like in the art world. Like before I was in the art world, I was just Dominican girl, whatever, Dominican. And like now it's like it's such a totally different experience. Because I do make like brown figures, and automatically people associate it with maybe like African American and that culture. But again, like that's never been my experience. I'm just trying to portray like the people in my culture. Like all these people that I create are my family members, are friends, and the idea of my work is to introduce that idea into people that don't know about the Dominican culture. Okay, Veronica, your turn.
So for me, a lot of just my childhood up into even just being a teenager and getting into college, a lot of the spaces that I create come from the idea that the interior and the domestic space was never something that was completely consistent, stable, and permanent.
Yeah.
A lot of the experiences that I've had was going from apartment to apartment, moving, at one point not having a home at all. And so for me, it just really became about who I did that with. And so for me, it became this unit, which was my family, and this kind of safe space for me, and reflecting on the relationships that we made together, and kind of our survivor mode of just surviving together. Um, and so to kind of take references of different places. So for instance, even this painting, growing up with risk 3, this one takes references from even an apartment in New Jersey to a photograph of my grandmother and her ex-husband, just going way in the past, but also going to more recent experiences and combining this idea of how relationships change over time, and really being able to reconstruct these relationships into something that I can share with other people, because the relationships in my life are what really formed my identity for myself. And I think that even when I make it about just painting and the fact that paintings come in layers, people come in layers, as corny as that sound. So for me, really painting and understanding that, you know, people have these different levels to them and these different layers to them, each of them consisting of so much compressed within, with their own specific story, that people don't really take at face value at first, because how can you when you just meet someone? And I think now, in a time of reflection where people just don't see one another at all, they don't see where they come from. They don't bother to think about where they may come from. And so for me, my identity really becomes sharing with other people and allowing myself to really embrace what I went through and change it up in a way where I can share it with other people and have them reflect on their identities themselves and where they come from. Yeah.
We're gonna welcome Karen back because we actually have some really interesting questions from um, the audience that I want us to be able to get to. Not everyone, I think, has to answer all of them, but if it's of interest to you to respond, I think one of the interesting ones, 'cause I want to make sure we get this one in because we have the parent, I believe, maybe of a 16-year-old who is a creative, aspiring creative, and wants to hear a little bit about what you were doing when you were 16 years old. If you knew that this may have been something you wanted to do, and what would you tell someone who's that young and interested in forging a career in the arts about some steps they can sort of take to sort of follow in your footsteps? So I want to make sure I get that one in first because it's important we open the doors for the future. Who wants to take a stab at that?
When I was 16, I mean, I could go first. When I was 16, I was unhinged as hell. I was not like, I wanted to be an artist, but I didn't know how to go about being an artist. And it was really a hot mess for a long time period in my life. I started taking art more and more serious, like as a career, when I was like in my 20s. And if you're 16 years old and you want to take this serious, like it comes with practice. Like start building our portfolio. Like you want to be a photographer, like go out, take pictures every day. There was one point in my life where I thought I was only going to be a photographer, and I carried my camera for like a year straight, always, everywhere I went. Like it's all about just like following whatever you like now, and it'll bring you to whatever you like later. Because I was doing watercolor, I was doing ceramics, I was doing photography, and then now I'm doing all of that shit combined by like doing installation work. So I just feel like for someone who's 16 and wants to figure out what they like start out with something that you like first, and then that will lead you to whatever in the future. Like start building discipline with at least like one of the many things you want to get into, you know? That would be my advice, at least.
I agree.
Wow.
I think just you know, follow whatever that interest is. I feel like 16 is still so young that like there's so much time to experiment. Like don't even box yourself in creatively and say I want to be this. Do everything, you know. Like when I was 16, artistically I was just drawing pictures of my boobs, to be honest. That's literally all I was interested in, my breasts. So I would be in my mirror sketching my breasts when I got home, because I was like that. I was interested in the body. I've always been interested in the body. I didn't know I wanted to be a painter. I didn't even know that was in my trajectory, but that's kind of how I started developing identity, like the visualization of like who am I on paper, you know, physically. And I think you don't know where anything leads, honestly. So just go with it.
Yeah. Also, I feel like all that's being said, and also I think I've spent a lot of time feeling bad for wanting to be an artist, because at being a Dominican immigrant, it's something that, like, you know, your parents come here, like my brother's a doctor, so it's just like I should be a doctor too, like, so it's just like to this day, even though I have a lot of support from my family and everything, I still have a lot of like, you know, kind of weird feelings about the position that I'm in. So all I'm saying is it's a valid career. And don't feel bad about wanting to pursue it. If you're gonna do it, just do it all the way, and don't let anybody get under your skin about it, because I don't know what background you have, but a lot of people step into this and are never doubted. And I feel like a lot of us from these communities, you step into it and every single person, family, friend, random neighbor will give you their 2 cents as to how you're gonna fail. So don't listen to them. Like a lot of people find very happy careers doing something creative, whether they're a solo like showing artist or they're in a creative company doing really awesome visual work. There's so many different outlets. Just, you know, like everybody was saying, build your portfolio, practice, 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 and just do it. Yeah.
I agree with Monica. I think that's great advice. And that's very real. The idea that like some people have the privilege of being supported from a young age in whatever they may choose, whereas some people like in our communities have this kind of you know, responsibility slash burden of like being better and like having the opportunities that your parents didn't have. Although being an artist would be having one of those opportunities, is not really acknowledged as such. But yeah, when I was 16, I was already in art school. However, I was having to convince really hard my parents that art was a thing, even though I wasn't necessarily thinking about it as like, this is the thing that I'm going to do forever. But at 16, that's what I wanted to do. And I got into this art school. The National School of Fine Arts in the Santo Domingo allows you to get in there since age, I think 15 or something. So I was there every day after school, and it became very serious because of all the time that I invested in it. But before, you know, at the moment of being like, am I really gonna do this or not, I had a lot of convincing to do with my mom and dad, who would be like, well, yes, art, but what about architecture? Is the same, but you can profit from it. Or what about graphic design? It's something like, they're mostly just worried about you because they don't see art as something that is sustainable. And it kind of isn't sometimes, but if you really love it, then that's what you gotta do.
I want to get to another really interesting question, and then there's some questions. There's actually a few questions um, on issues of colorism from someone who's anonymous in the audience, and another one, and we'll welcome the conversation. I'm going to summarize them to frame it around the work, but before we get into that one, because I think that that one that's a 3-day long seminar with that's sort of required. I want to make sure that we keep it within the frame of the exhibition and the work that you're doing. But there's a really fascinating question that says, I feel many of you, and this is from Vanessa Arismendi from The Hammer, I feel like many of you have been able to cleverly use digital space, both in terms of your social media presence and as a tool in your practice. Like Joyri's Tropicon, can you speak to how digital spheres can be useful in complicating the patriarchal and colonial relics of expressing identity or Latinidad? It's an excellent question. I think really important because a lot of you have really large social media followings, and it's a really interesting sort of aspect of it. So if you want to respond to that question.
I can respond to that. For me, like social media initially, I've been active like on Instagram since I was 18 and 25 now. And for me, I kind of treated it as sort of its own project for a really long time. I was very interested in how we represent ourselves. And that was during a time where I felt really like not seen. So I only felt like I existed in photographs or stuff, where I felt really insecure about a lot of things. So I started documenting it and sharing it and seeing the feedback and creating kind of community in that way. I would take pictures, highly edited pictures of my acne. I would say to myself, like, you know, people edit it out. What happens if I edit it to make it bolder? Like kind of flipping those kind of ideas on their head and just sharing things that I was insecure about. And also, yeah, and through that I found a lot of like community, and I found a lot of opportunities in the future. It was obviously very difficult at first because people weren't very receptive to that kind of stuff, but I feel like the internet for me is one of my favorite things. It can be a very toxic and volatile place, but at the same time we are all kind of on this search for something on there, and like-minded people find like-minded people, and you find things that also challenge your beliefs and sometimes teach you things that you wouldn't have otherwise learned. So I think it's very important in you know, the diaspora and uniting us all under whatever it is that we're trying to explore, and seeing like, oh, this person's halfway across the world, but the imagery they're making is kind of similar to mine, and they're exploring very similar things. And through that, we realize we're kind of like on the same quest. And so I find that very helpful and very cool just to share on there and see what happens and who I can meet.
You was on your body positivity before anybody, period. You was on the front lines getting attacked. And I used to be there defending you, like, shut the fuck up, you get acne too, bitch. But I feel like for social media, like I used it as a portfolio of everything. And I feel like that's why my social media following grew, because anytime I made something new, I would immediately post it. As some people who like would really wait and like not share their process, like I was really like on the internet like every day. Like, okay, I finished this one piece, I'm gonna put it up. I finished this other piece, I'm gonna put it up. And it went from like, I remember when I used to do fur shit and I'll get like 50 likes. And then it went from like 50 likes to 5,000 or whatever. And I feel like also like Instagram found my profile and I'm posting on Instagram. Like, I feel like all of these things like developed because I was so open with like, this is what I do, hire me. This is what I do, put me in your gallery. This is what I do, put me in your museum. Like, I was very much like super fucking dedicated to being somewhere. And when I logged into my social media, I was like, oh no, I'm already this person and people just need to open their purse. So I feel like if you're gonna like, I feel like a lot of people are scared of getting online and being like, what if this happens? And I'm like, if you talented, like it's gonna happen. Like that's inevitable. Someone's gonna come through, someone's gonna copy their shit. Like I feel like we're in the era of mood board, no brain. I'm gonna do the same shit I just saw. Like you're gonna have to accept that as an artist. Obviously, if it's a corporation, like blast them. But like it's one of those things where like it could be negative, like always sharing your work, but it could be positive because I feel like I had such a good experience with Instagram. Like I wouldn't be on this panel if it wasn't for Instagram. Like I feel like Instagram was the way that like really put myself out there, and it killed the middleman. Because before, at one point I was going into galleries like physically like, hey, can you represent me? I got shut down by 101 people. And I was like, you know what? Fuck that. I'm going to like make my own way. Like, I'm not going to like wait for these people. Like, I'm already that somebody. And then that's how I treated myself on the internet. Like, I'm this person. I do this. This is me. Hire me. Period. I don't know.
Oh, I was like
Can
looking
I
for the
make a
clapping
comment
emoji.
for a second?
Right.
Yeah.
Uzumaki, I think what I'm hearing from you as a person of color, me as a person of color and a woman, I'm hearing from you somebody that's saying, I'm going to take charge of my own destiny. and, forget what everybody else says. I'm just going to do it. And I find that that's what you have to do in this society in America to survive. You have to say, you're not going to tell me who I am, how I'm supposed to think, what I can do, when I can do it. I will tell you what I will do when I can do it. And if you tell me no, I'm going to do it anyway, because this is how I feel I want to do it. And I feel this has been going on for generations for people of color. And Uzumaki, thank you so much for saying that, because a lot of people don't speak this truth. So all of you ladies, reach as far as you can, reach for the stars and catch reality on the way down. Don't ever let somebody tell you you can't do something. People tell me that all the time. In this art world, don't listen to them. Don't let them put you in boxes either.
Karen, thank you.
We have a lot of questions, and I'm gonna take a few. There's a couple that I think we can sort of address if we combine them. And thank you everybody for sending your questions, and they're really sort of remarkable. I want to have, because this is sort of an interesting and challenging one, but there have been two questions, and it's been a recurring topic. I'm gonna address the question that someone asked that was an anonymous, because I just in these platforms, I think, all of the artists that are participating in the conversation, and we're recording this for posterity, you're speaking, and the audience gets to see who you are. So as a courtesy to you all, I'm not going to respond to anonymous questions that I think are particularly directed at some of you. I encourage you to please do that, so that we at least know and have some context in being able to pose these questions. What I will say is, there's a question around, and I think I won't interpret it, I'll read it, but it says, between ethnic nationalities and phenotype, do you all ever wonder how your phenotype in that nationality compares to others? I never hear anyone from the Caribbean countries talk about this. For example, would you trust someone who doesn't look like you, but is from the same country of origin, or someone who looks like you genetically, which I don't, who may not be from your ethnic origin, like Haiti? I think, I mean, it's a challenging question. I think it's a colorism question that many of us sort of have. I'm
I
just gonna
feel
post
like
that out.
when it comes to Dominican Republic, a lot of people gotta understand that not all Dominicans is white and not all Dominicans is black. You will see a Dominican with blue eyes, curly hair. They'll come to America. They'll be white passing because, of course, like, race has become such a social construct here in America. Whereas there'll be a Dominican who will be dark and have curly hair and then come to America or whatever, and they're considered fully black. Um, I feel like that is kind of tricky, because also colonialism hit Dominican Republic very hard, where racism is different. You would have black people being like, I'm not black, I'm Dominican. They'll hide like they associate blackness with something evil in a way, even though they're black. They'll be like, oh no, I'm not black, I'm Indio. And you'll be like, you're black. Like, you know what I mean? So I feel like it depends when it comes to the whole like trusting thing of someone who looks like you, because it can like, it's very complicated in DR, because you'll have a black person like who's black and be like putting you down, or you'll have a white person who's doing kind of the same thing. Like, it's crazy, because the oppression will come from both sides in DR specifically. So I just feel like colorism is like super complicated over there, because a lot of Dominicans like resonate with, like, they're okay with their oppression without even knowing it, by like, like siding with whiteness and white supremacy without even knowing it. I don't even know if that makes sense, but like, that's how I feel. Cause like, there's a lot of Dominicans that I would not trust. That's me just being real. Like, it's like, oh, if I'm trusting you on my liberty, hell nah. Like, you got a lot of colorism, anti-blackness to unpack. Like, I don't know.
There's a lot of like generational things too. that they're unaware of, like you said, like they do it and it's like they don't even know, but that's
Yeah.
like definitely, I think, is super apparent in the Dominican Republic. I feel like it's different here. I don't know, maybe it's more about race in America, and racism. I don't know. That's just like what I've been kind of experiencing and like.
Well, it's the same in a sense,
Mhm.
like racism, but in a different way. Like
Yeah.
you'll have black people in DR like assimilating themselves from blackness to be more white, and then you come over here, and it's happening, but in a whole different way. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
probably not as not yeah, it's all different. It's different, but it's the same context. Like it's racism and people just upholding white supremacy in different styles, which is annoying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it happens in both places, and it just takes different form because we have
Yeah.
different histories that have taken different forms. Like in the DR, you don't have like a civil rights movement. You also don't have segregation in history in such a stark way as it happened here. So then you have
Right.
different outcomes and different ways in which people express their affinity or rejection of their ideas of race and how they construct that. I was gonna say something else I forgot. But yeah, I mean, also I think this question is kind of strange. I don't know if I would like place the idea of trust in relation to, ethnic nationality and phenotypes. Like I know what they're saying, but I don't want to pick, this example of like either or. Like, why would I need to trust someone who's from my own country but is differently what phenotypically or versus someone who looks like me genetically but is not from my own country? Why can't I just trust both? Or why couldn't I have reasons to distrust both? I don't think either of those are markers for which I should place my trust or dismiss trust in someone. I understand what they're trying to say, but just relating the idea of trust to ethnicity, I understand it in like the hierarchies and colonialism and white supremacy and all of that. But at the same time, I can't dismiss trusting you only based on the matter that you are white. I mean, I have to you know negotiate other things and see what you're where you're standing, whether you're an ally or if you're not. Same thing with a black person, like Uzumaki said. In the DR, you see like all sorts of examples of how people position themselves in relation to these hierarchies and what they want to be adjacent to and what they want to like benefit from. And it doesn't always come down to what you would expect from an American point of view. And at the same time, also in the US, you also have this situations that are not always what they seem like. So yeah.
I'm gonna move us to the next question because there's some really good questions that I hope to get. But someone asked, when showcasing works of art that express trauma, what is the best advice you can give to an up and coming artist on finding comfort of having others view you in that light?
Um, I feel like I'm always putting out my trauma, and I feel like if you're gonna do it, just be prepared for everybody's commentary. Like, I feel like it's dope to do it because you open conversation and it's a form of therapy for yourself. Well, for me at least, I'm speaking from my perspective. Like, the reason I'm so open with my trauma is because I do want to start a conversation around it. And I'm okay, but also in the same breath, it like puts everybody in your business and like ready to give 2 cents that you might have not asked for. So I just think like if you're gonna like, it's like everything's not about trauma either, but I feel like I experienced a lot of it, and that's why I use a lot of it in my work, where where I was okay with being vulnerable because I wanted to hear these conversations because I feel like I never got the support. I never got the support I wanted until I started having these conversations through my art, and then more like-minded people started like coming around me and kind of aiding me in that way. So what's cool about it is that, you know, you could find a community as you share your trauma. You could find a community who could also uplift you and help you process these things. But also in the same breath, like, you will have some people like talking shit and you're gonna be like, what the hell, you know? So it's all about, like, if you're gonna do it, like, know that it's like a double-edged sword. But for the most part, my community grew, my self-love grew, everything grew when I started being more vulnerable about what has happened to me and why I make the work that I make. I don't know. That's just me though.
Yeah, I agree. But it's also sometimes a slippery slope in the sense that you find yourself having to perform trauma as a
right.
person of color. I feel like white artists sometimes their work has an inherent like neutrality, and like their work is looked at like the work is looked at as their work, or specifically what they're talking about isn't necessarily tried to viewed through the lens of all of these different political things. And I feel like I would even find myself, like I remember 2019 was like a really good year for me, where I felt like I had released a lot of the different things that fueled my work. And I found myself unable to make work that whole year. And it was very difficult. And I found myself like, I'm actually at a point where I'm feeling pretty happy and stable. I mean, I went out the window 2020, but you know, how do you like produce work when you feel better? Like, and when people expect this like sort of deep, like, and like the idea of deep having to be this painful experience, it's something that's kind of like, I think ingrained in our bodies, because we are oftentimes the product of a lot of trauma, like even our existence to this day, and the fact even our complexion is rooted in trauma. So it's kind of something that I feel like it will find its way in a lot of our works, but at the same time, it doesn't always have to be the basis. And if you're trying to express something outside of it, you are going to be confronted with a lot of people that don't know how to read your work unless it's about something traumatic. Like there'll just be like, okay, you like, these are all just happy people in an interior space, but where's the trauma? Like they'll add in narratives that you're not even trying to talk about just because of what they assume of your background. So it's whether you're talking about trauma or not, people will make it about trauma, unfortunately.
I agree with that. I feel like when you're painting figures of color, especially, you had said that people assign, it's kind of like they assign trauma to your work, even if that's not the narrative you're putting forward. I mean, it's great for self-reflection, and, you know, there is always something to unpack, but I think it is always interesting and also a little bit exhausting to sometimes have to push back against someone projecting trauma onto your work when it's, you know, it could be the most beautiful scenic painting in the world, but because of the fact that whether you're an artist of color or the subject is a figure of color, that there has to be some sort of traumatic layer involved. I think that's just part of those conversations. So when you do want to inject it like into the work, your own personal trauma, then you do have to own it and be willing, like Uzumaki said, to have the conversations and to lead them, definitely, and to take ownership of it.
Anybody want to say anything else, or should we take another question? We have like one, we're gonna like one and then a really quick one, and we're gonna sort of wrap it up. But somebody asked if there's any rituals or mantras that you go by to help you during those days where it's difficult to create. So that's sort of the first question. And then the other question, which is sort of in many ways what I hope we would sort of wrap up with, but someone asks, you know, what are other ways that you've unpacked the nuances of defining identity? Because here we've been talking specifically about your visual art practices, but are there any other elements that sort of, you know, help you sort of navigate this? Is it, you know, speaking with family, writing, reading? So I guess in many ways, it's also, I think I'd like to maybe expand that question and sort of ask, like, what are other influences or things that inform your practice that maybe help you sort of, you know, shape how you go about this? So those two things, are there any rituals that help you get to those days when the studio doesn't work? And then the other one is, you know, how else do you sort of unpack these notions of identity that isn't necessarily related to the visual artwork that you make?
I think Mantra, I don't have a specific mantra. I think when I don't want to paint, I don't paint. Honestly, because I like to paint from like this place of like love and this energy. So if it's not hitting that day. I just try to, read or do some other type of activity that could spark that energy in me. But outside of my painting, before I say a couple of years ago, I started a project that was specifically tracing my lineage through oral history. So asking family on both sides and writing it down and being very diligent about recording everything about where my family comes from. That really gave me a concrete idea of who I am as a person in regards to, the past ancestry. I've never done one of those tests. It's all been specifically oral history. And I've been lucky enough that my grandmother has kept like such rigorous records. And I will say other countries have some really dope archives that I feel like America doesn't have in a lot of ways for people of color. So I've been able to access documents and learn so much about where I come from. And I feel like those things kind of inform how I, concretely move in the world and how these bodies exist on a canvas. And for me, that I think is kind of my mental ritual for making my paintings.
Who else wants to respond?
I think for me, I don't really have mantras either, but the thing I do tend to reflect on a lot when I feel uninspired or unmotivated, I have to repeat to myself, I'm an artist, I know what I'm doing, because I have a lot of imposter syndrome and feel like I don't belong a lot of the time. So I just have to remind myself that I know what I'm doing and everything in my life has led up to this point where I'm making this painting and that I know everything that I need to know for this specific painting. And as far as like the other part of the question, I've actually never done my ancestry results either specifically. My brother did them, but even prior to that, he would spend a lot of time calling the older family members and by hand creating family trees, and even his estimations based off of their accounts, he was able to get really accurately close to the ancestry results that he got, the genetic results. So we've always been kind of very interested in kind of really figuring out where we're from. He even found old records in the Dominican Republic that talked about on my grandma's side, who's Spaniard, like the land that they own in Santiago and stuff like that. So in that sense, it's been kind of a really cool experience of like finding out where I'm from. But for me, it came from taking classes and reading about these kind of things, and then realizing the ways in which it was more than Spanish culture, like a lot of Dominicans tend to talk about it, that influences your day to day. Like I took an Afro-Caribbean religions class and I realized even the regular Catholicism that's practiced in my home isn't the full picture. It's not something that the Vatican would approve of. So I realized all the West African influences in that.
Right. Anyone else?
I honestly would say I'm always in the studio. And for me, I think this year I realized the most that if you can't work, I think you need to give yourself some type of break. I don't think it's, we're human beings, we're not machines. You're not meant to really force yourself to be always working all the time. Unfortunately, we live in a society where you kind of have to. But the thing is, you don't have to, and I think you're the most productive when you really put your energy somewhere else and something that you really feel you can make use of your time. For me, I recently I got a bunch of books. If you can't afford books, I think the most helpful thing to do if you can't afford art books, if you can't afford just physical books, the internet is a great thing as well. If you have a phone, you can really go out, you can see other artists, you can see what they're making and get inspired, whether it be by color, shape, whatever. And if you do want to get into books, reading is something that I forced myself to start doing. And if you're somebody that really just can't read like me, I got like 4 brain cells and I'm finally getting into reading. It feels so great to finally finish a few books and you're like, wow, like I've been missing out on this whole, this whole experience that I just, I had in college and then I stopped doing because, you're like out on your own. And that just completely inspires me as well. And just doing what you enjoy unapologetically, like watching your favorite TV shows. I think you need to give yourself time, and stop forcing yourself to think you always have to work every 2 seconds. Like, it's ridiculous. So.
Does Does anyone else want to share anything before we wrap it up?
I agree with Veronica. I think there's like this expectation, and you almost get in this rhythm of working all the time where it's hard to get out. Like I find myself fantasizing about nature a lot, but actually enjoying it very little. Like I love going camping and hiking and I don't know, camping at the beach or whatever, but it happens twice a year, like way less than what I wish it could happen. Like maybe going out to a park for a walk or something that's more accessible. But even that, I don't really get to do as often as I fantasize about it. I watch a lot of anime when I don't know what to do in the studio, or like favorite series. I also find myself fantasizing about watching movies because they're too long for me to like use them as a break. So I prefer series. But I think like I'm kind of getting used to, or kind of, I guess, making that space for self-care again, because I've been in the train of like just a lot of work where I don't even have a chance to, like, I have to put it on my calendar so something else doesn't occupy it, you know? Yeah.
Anybody else? Tiffany, you don't want to share anything? You want to wrap us up and bring us home?
I mean, I agree with everyone. Like, I feel like I've lost track of, I guess, self-care, like just taking care of myself with all this workload. And it's really not it's really unrealistic to um, expect artists to work every single day, every single second, because we're just like everyone else. We need a break. And when I do get a break, that I really enjoy listening to music. I'm super big on music. Like that's a big part of who I am and how I grew up. So I usually partake in stuff like that, a lot of music. If you guys have any reading suggestions for me, go ahead, because I'm trying to get into that. But yeah, that's typically my self-care, my music, and on the weekends maybe do my little face mask, hair mask, all this stuff to like disconnect from art. Like I get it, I'm an artist, but there's other stuff to me as well. So yeah.
Um, I just wanted to say, thank you for staying on for almost 90 minutes. And I just wanted to say how privileged I feel to have gotten an opportunity to know about your work. And thank Tiffany and also Karen for letting me into this process. One of the things, the interesting thing, because there's a lot of questions about references. I've been making my own sort of reading list of sorts, that I use as research material as I've been thinking and writing on your work, that I am happy to send over to the gallery to find, maybe we can find a place for it. Everything from kind of looking at early Dominican cinema to a reading list of both articles and books, that could be an interesting sort of resource of sorts. There are some remarkable Dominican women poets who were writing in the 20s and 30s, who I haven't found translations, but if you read Spanish. So for those in the audience who've asked for the kind of resource material, contextualizing material, I'll be happy to sort of send that along, and maybe the gallery can include it on the website page, and perhaps along this exhibition can also be a resource in many ways to fill in some of the gaps that are sort of lesser known, not when it comes to the context from which this work is in conversation with.
That's great. That's great, Cesar. And I think, did you also put it in the chat?
Some of them, not all of them, but there's some chats that are being posted. Those are some interesting, I think, primers and introductory material if you're interested more in understanding, I think, just the nature of kind of visual culture more broadly, from very specifically, I think the Dominican Republic and kind of histories of constructions of beauty, kind of just visual imagery and photography. And then there's more information I'm happy to share, but this is a starter in the chat here.
I think that's great. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. Do you guys have one last thing you want to say before I wrap it up here? Cesar, do you have anything, ladies?
Thank you, Cesar. The conversation with you before all this was really awesome, and I felt like you handled all of our stories so well, and focusing especially on all the things that make us individual and different, rather than doing what a lot of people tend to do, which is just mash us together into one story. So I really appreciate how much thought and care you put into this, and thank you, Tiffany, for bringing us all together as well.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome. I also want to thank my team at Jenkins Johnson Projects, Karen Benke and Rachel Shaudu and Michael Howard. It really takes a village to put all this together, and that's our team. And we have a new registrar, Calvin. So thank you all. I wanted to wish you all a happy Valentine's Day tomorrow or Sunday. But prior to that, tomorrow at 4 o'clock Eastern, I wanted to invite everybody to a live exhibition walkthrough via Instagram Live. We'll walk through the exhibition with the artist and see the installation, and to celebrate the beauty of the exhibition and the artists who've contributed to this important show. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Peace out.